So the talk is context-driven development. My name is Jenny. And I'm a backend developer at Collage, a software company based in Taiwan. It has a great culture as manifested by the fact that our production system has nothing to do with Elixir, while the company still sponsors and supports me to be here. And the reason that I'm here today is because that I want to talk to you about, sorry, I'm just going to take this out because I'm apparently too short for this. Okay. The reason why I'm here today is because I want to talk to you about my relationship with Phoenix. We had a passionate start. It was 2 years ago at a hackathon. And I just learned about Elixir and I was so excited. So when the opportunity came at this hackathon, I decided to build an application with Phoenix. And let me say, the experience was mind-blowing. I was able to put together a server that has an authentication scheme, integration with third-party API, and is hooked up with a database. Her response was snappy. And of course, big plus is that it's written in Elixir, so what more can you ask for? But as I tried to dig deeper into Phoenix, I found context, and it greatly confused me. It confused me to a point that I stopped the development of my project completely for months, and I threw myself into this quest of finding out the perfect answer to the question, what the hell do I do with context? So this is what you can expect from this talk. I'll first explain what about context that makes it such a challenge, and my journey to build a proper architecture with it. And the result is what I call context-driven development. So let's get started. First of all, context is a concept brought up with Phoenix 1.3. There's this nice page on the Phoenix official guide that explains what it is. And to quote this page, contexts are dedicated modules that expose and group related functionality. So the goal of it is to provide guidance to architect your application code. And to understand what role context plays in Phoenix, let's first look at the MVC structure that Phoenix is based on. So when a request comes in, each component takes up responsibility, and together they produce a response that to send back. Yes, and this is how Phoenix organizes its components. So on the left is the file structure. So suppose your app is called your app. The role of controller and view is put under the your app web folder. And the role of model is put under your app folder. And this is what context comes in. It is a guidance to how you can actually structure the model as part of your application. So that's nice and clear. But when it comes to implementation, I find some things particularly challenging. So first of all, it seems that there's a lot of things that we need to learn before we can make this work. So if we look at the guide to context again, you'll find that at the beginning there are requirements. And if we zoom in, you'll see that we need to know how Phoenix works in general, request to response journey, and also ACTO, the Phoenix database layer. So when I tried to develop with context, I was juggling with the concept of all context, ACTO, and my own business logic all at the same time. That is to say, when I write my business logic, I have to think about the underlying scheme, what underlying schema looks like, and the performance aspect of my database queries. In the meantime, I also need to think about if this piece of logic is its context of its own or it's another context, and if it does, what should be its relationship with other contexts. So that's a lot to think about at the same time. And the second challenge is that relationships between components are ambiguous. So to quote official guide again, it says, it actually gives us a flexibility to decide how big our context should be. And we can also decide relationships between them. And the guideline that it has on this matter is that when in doubt, create a new context. So from what I've seen in many projects, this guideline results in a really flat file structure. And it has some amazing benefits, but it also creates the problem that the dependencies between each context can be messy. That is, if context A depends on context B, there's no way to tell from the file structure that this relationship exists. And also, it's hard to tell if two contexts share a schema underneath. So those are the reasons that I went to this frenzied trip to find out how to work with context. And there are a lot of methods that I've tried and which didn't work. First of all, if you want to learn anything, learning by example is always a good way. However, that didn't work for me this time. It seems each open source project has its own idea about the architecture. So most of them are the flat architecture that I mentioned earlier, and it wasn't what I was looking for. And the next thing I tried was DDD, because of course I hunted down every piece of comment Chris McCord has ever said. And in his introduction to context, he spent some time explaining that this term comes from the bounded context in DDD. So with the termination of Barney in Chasing Down Hot Girls, I decided I will tackle this complex graph that is the concept of DDD. And I spent more than a decent amount of time in that before I realized I was going in the wrong direction. Because learning DDD doesn't really help with explaining what context is, because context in Phoenix and the bounded context in DDD, they are actually quite different things, in my opinion. Sorry, I watched way too much How I Met Your Mother when I was making the slides, and also Fleabag and Killing Eve. But after all the trials and errors and the long hours wandering in Elixir forum, I saw an unrelated thread where a person was giving an example of how they implement GraphQL DDD CQR as hexagonal-like architecture. And I thought, great architecture. And that was when I realized where my frustrations with context come from. So once again, let's look at the code. So context, the concept of it is that context is a guidance. It is not a set of rules to be conformed to, with a promise that it will produce a good application structure. So the reason why that it doesn't answer my question was because those questions are not context concern. That is, if I want to have an awesome, clear, super maintainable structure in my application, I need to build that myself instead of relying on context alone. Context is this guideline that we keep in mind while we implement our awesome, clear, super maintainable structure. So my plan is simple. I'll try to build this application with a good structure, and then I'll try to squeeze in, apply the idea of context into it. So the question, once I crack that, the question becomes, how do I actually do that? I decided I'll just steal the clean architecture framework proposed by Robert Martin. I chose it because it's proved to work and has a good layering and a good flow of dependencies and a good diagram. And also because the main point of this talk is how to apply context to your application. So whatever I chose was just a starting point. I will quickly go through the concept of this design, and just to make sure we establish the common ground before we move on. So in this design, we'll have 4 layers. At the innermost layer, we have domain. It has all the business logic and it's not dependent on anything. Further up, we have use case, use case layer, which is the orchestration between the domain and adapter, and also it controls transaction management. Adapter is this translation layer that will implement that translates between the inner layers and the outer layer, which is our infrastructure layer. The infrastructure layer has all the technical details and also controls all the external dependency. So if we slice it in a different direction, this is the flow of dependencies where you can see domains where everything depends on. And the file structure is straightforward. It just mirrors the 4 layers, so no surprise. So under domain layer, we can further break it down to sub-layers. We'll use a model as the data structure that we pass around. The store defines the interface for our outer layers, like the database repo. And service is where our business logic lives. And use case is, again, straightforward. These are imaginary use cases that should be quite common for user-facing application. And likewise, in adapter layer, we can have things like command line interface, or a web layer, which is where Phoenix-related code can go. And a folder of database store, of course. This is where Acto can go. And our infrastructure layer is mostly application-wide files. So that was a really quick walkthrough of the clean architecture design. Now we have this base that we can later apply context to. But let's first look at what we have built so far, if that solved the problems I had. First of all, now we have separations of concerns thanks to that 4 layers. And secondly, we have a clean relationship between components now. And the bonus point is now very testable because of the 2 point above. So this is not bad, right? We now have built a software that future maintainers won't hate. And this is a good exercise in itself, by the way. But as successful as it seems, we are not done yet. Specifically, if it has nothing to do with context. And we have, so what is the role of context in this? How could we apply it? So again, the code. If we reflect it back to our current structure, it doesn't really group related functionality together. So let's see an example. A common scenario of an application is that it will send notifications to users. So let's see how that will play out in our current structure. So in the domain layer, most likely we'll have a notification model. And we'll also have interface for the notification store and user store. And in our use case layer, we'll have this method called notify user. And adapter will implement the interfaces mentioned just earlier in the domain layer, and also be the caller of the use case. And if we group them all together, we have a list of files. And the first layer that we see is its technical category. And actually, for some paths, the second, even the third layer is their technical category as well. It is only at the last that we can find something that has a meaning in the business sense. So that was our problem, and that's what context wants to solve. And if we looked at the dependency diagram again, and draw a line between them and fold it. we can put them into two broad categories of external and internal. And let's block the external part for a second because it's not the juice of our application. And on the right is the juice of our application. So how do we apply context? That's just add a layer on top of everything. So so like this, just and let's see what the module names will look like. And with our notification example, it will probably look like this. And the first scope would be the name of the context. And use case would be this method inside of the context. And the domain can be nicely placed into the next layer on the context. So that so this is a file structure. Again, the file notification is our context and is also our public interface or use case. And this is what the code looks like. So I created a simple app called Elixir Lab. So Elixir Lab is the app name. Here we have one method called notify user, which takes the user ID and a message. Again, and the method implementation is really straightforward. We first normalize the input into a notification structure. Then we call notification store and user store separately to perform some actions. And these are the dependencies. Here we orchestrate the components in the domain layer to accomplish the set operation. And the components are nicely placed into a folder of its name. So let's look at the files inside the subfolder. Notification is quite straightforward. It's a model, it's a structure that holds the notification model. And it gets interesting when we go to the store. So first of all, this is where we define the interface for the notification store. We can use Elixir's behavior to achieve this. And now comes to the decision of where we would declare the implementation exactly. We've got some options. For example, we can inject the implementation module at the layer that calls it, or we can write like this, where we use the macro def delegate to delegate the responsibility to another module at compile time. Oh, what happened? Okay. And we also assign the default module for it. So the caller layer can remain blissfully unaware of what the exact implementation is. So the user store module is kind of the same. We define the interface and assign the default implementation module. So that's it. Now let's talk about a bit about the cross-context relationship. Because however carefully you design your system, it is unavoidable that you will run into a use case where you need to use more than one context. Once again, the example app name is Elixir Lab. Assume that this app has two contexts for now, account and notification. And it's a common scenario in user registration that after successfully creating the user record, we will want to send a welcome notification to the user. So where do I put that code? One option, and probably the most instinctive option, is to call the notification context in the account context. But that will create this implicit dependency from account to notification. And we don't want that. Sure, we can use dependency injection to make it explicit, but that would mean that the caller of this method would need to know that this dependency exists. So not good either. Another option is to put this code in their common parent, which is the Elixir Lab module, so that Elixir Lab serves as a public API or the use case in our previous structure, and each context can remain free of dependencies from each other. So this is the file structure of the internal layer, and we put it under Elixir Lab folder. And we will have this Elixir Lab external folder that will have the outer layers. And this folder will serve as an adapter and infrastructure layer in our previous structure. So this is the result of applying the context of the idea of context to clean architecture. It still has all the advantage of a clean architecture, but now it also is meaningful in the sense that apart from the technical concerns, the business concerns are now very, very clear as well. So here we arrive at our final stop. This talk is an experiment on how to have a proper architecture with the spirit of context. And what context is to me is that we should separate our business concerns by grouping similar functionalities with module names and corresponding file structure. And it's important to point out that we can do that precisely because of the flexibility that Elixir module gives us. That is, there's no magic behind those modules' names like they are in, say, Rails. So there's no complex autoloading or behind-the-scene mechanism for you to mess up. We are allowed to experiment as we want and group them into different business domains as we see fit without any cost. But we should use it carefully because context only tells you to separate your business concerns, not your technical concerns. So it can get messy if you don't spend time thinking about those technical layers like I did when I first started. That said, I think context brings up an important aspect that we sometimes just overlook. This is not a new idea either. Years ago, again, Robin Martin has famously broadcast the term screaming architecture. And it's the same idea as having context. It reminds us that the code base shouldn't not just be about the technical components, but what this application actually does. So at last, if you didn't take in any of the previous slides, what I want you to take home is this. What got me stuck with context for so long was because I was desperately trying to squeeze my idea of application into the framework. While instead, it should totally be the other way around. We should be like the conductor in the orchestra that has the total control. And the framework should just be this player that conforms to your awesome, super clean, super maintainable application. So Phoenix is our application. But it took me months to truly realize what it means. That's it. And those are the resources that helped me along the way. Not in any particular order. I just owe so much to each of them. I didn't show a lot of code during this talk, but I actually implemented a simple app while I was experimenting. So feel free to check it out if you're curious about the specifics. I need to spend some time on the documentation, though. There are two branches. One is purely clean architecture style, and the second branch is the result of applying context. And Jenny_codes is my Twitter handle. I'm trying to get myself into the habit of opening it more. And when I do, remember, I post very random thoughts on it. That probably doesn't sound like a strong argument for you to check me out, but I want to engage more, so please talk to me. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm ahead of time, so I guess questions? Yes?
So I probably, like everyone here, are still wondering how umbrella apps are meant to work. I wondered, did you give any thought to how or whether an umbrella app would be a good idea?
Umbrella app? Huh. I have nothing to say about that. Yeah, I personally haven't tried that yet. So sorry, I just heard about things, but I have no personal opinions on it. Anyone else? Yes?
In your journey kind of learning about context, did you come across or give any thought to whether nested contexts ever have, if that's a good idea, or and kind of maybe when that would be appropriate, if it was a good idea?
Can you give an example of? So the question is if I've given any thoughts on nested context. Can you give any examples?
Is it appropriate to ever nest context? So you talked about, if you have an account context and a notification context,
Mm-hmm.
you don't want to develop a dependency to those. You can put kind of the logic at the parent level.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that there needs to be there's a context that fits that parent level that's smaller than your entire app. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that actually makes sense. I think as so this app I'm demoing is a really simple app, but I do imagine when the app grows, you will need kind of a hierarchy of context. But the central idea is that you group your first level concerns by business, not by the technical components. So yeah, I think that's definitely doable. Hey.
I have a pattern that I've used for that I call like a coordinator.
Coordinator.
So the coordinator layer sits above the serp or the contexts and can use any context, but it always has to have the downward dependencies. They can't talk to each other.
Okay. So that would be like the use case.
So
The coordinator would be the use case.
in your example, you could have a user registration coordinator that would call into the user
Mm-hmm.
or the accounts, and then the notify service or the notify context. But your Phoenix app, your Phoenix controllers could call directly into any context. They don't have to call into the coordinator. But
So
I like to use the dependency tree a little bit.
so the role of the coordinator would be what?
The coordinator is basically a way to orchestrate multiple contexts.
But then your controller doesn't really call coordinator.
Yeah. So if you have like a register endpoint,
Uh-huh.
you could call right to the coordinator and call register.
Uh-huh.
But if you're just retrieving things, like
Oh, okay.
accounts, you could call directly to the account.
I see. So it's a extra layer for controllers to call, but controllers can still call directly. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. If no one else, I think that's it. Have a good lunch. Thank you.